The brass bell above the convenience store door gave a cheerful jingle as Melanie stepped inside, though the warmth of the sound did little to settle the unease in her chest. The early afternoon light streamed through the storefront windows, illuminating the meticulously stocked shelves and the polished tile floors. Behind the counter, Jonathan Reynolds stood meticulously sorting through a pile of receipts, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. His dark eyes flicked upward at the sound of the bell, and the corners of his mouth curled into a polite smile. "Good afternoon," Jonathan greeted, setting the papers aside. "You must be Melanie." Melanie hesitated. Her hand hovered just above the strap of her purse, gripping it tightly before finally exhaling and stepping further into the store. "Yeah," she said, her voice stiff as she took in Jonathan's appearance. She hadn't expected him to be, well, him, the store's owner, her new boss. Jonathan extended a hand toward her, his posture relaxed and open. For a moment, his friendly gesture just hung there, the air between them thick with an unspoken tension. Melanie stared at the hand, her fingers twitching at her sides. After a long pause, she nodded curtly, ignoring the offer of a handshake. "Let's just get started," she muttered, glancing away. Jonathan let his hand drop back to his side, though his easy smile remained. He gestured toward a narrow hallway at the back of the store. "My office is this way. We can talk in private." Melanie followed, her footsteps clipped and precise, as if each step required a conscious effort. Jonathan led her into a modest office, tidy, functional, with a desk pushed against the far wall, an old but well-maintained filing cabinet standing guard in the corner, and a small coffee maker humming quietly beside a stack of ledgers. She sat stiffly in the chair opposite his desk, her back ramrod straight. When Jonathan slid a folder in front of her, she barely glanced at it. "I've looked over your resume," he said, his tone professional yet measured. "You've got a solid background in retail management, 15 years at different stores, handling everything from inventory to hiring." "I can do the job," Melanie interrupted, her voice clipped and even. Jonathan studied her for a beat, his fingers laced together on the desk. "I don't doubt that," he said. "We need someone with your level of experience to help manage the store's daily operations." He flipped open the folder, scanning a few lines. "You'd be working closely with our lead employee, Vanessa. She's been filling in as manager, and she'll be training you on how we do things here." Melanie's fingers drummed against the armrest of her chair. "Fine," she said shortly. Jonathan nodded, ignoring the tightness in her voice. "She'll be here tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. She knows every detail of the store's workflow, so she'll get you up to speed." "Understood," Melanie muttered. She stood too quickly, the chair scraping against the tile as she pushed it back. Jonathan watched as she adjusted the strap of her purse, her knuckles whitening around the leather. The bell above the door jingled once more as Melanie stepped into the late afternoon air. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and something vaguely sweet from a nearby bakery, but she barely noticed. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the bus stop. "Working for him," she muttered under her breath. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Then, unbidden, an image flashed through her mind. Her mother's frail frame, her once bright eyes dulled by pain. The pile of unopened medical bills on their small dining table. The way the nurses spoke to her in hushed tones during her last visit to the hospital. Their voices gentle but full of things she didn't want to hear. Melanie closed her eyes briefly. "I don't have a choice," she whispered to herself. The pay at Jonathan's store was better than anything she'd been offered in months. It would keep them afloat. Barely. But it was something. Lost in thought, she turned a corner and collided hard with another pedestrian. A small gasp escaped the young woman she'd bumped into, and Melanie instinctively reached out to steady herself against a nearby lamppost. She barely caught a glimpse of the girl, a black woman, maybe in her early 20s with dark eyes wide with surprise. A purse swung loosely from her shoulder. Melanie felt a sharp flash of irritation rise in her chest. "Watch where you're going," she snapped, her voice laced with frustration. "You people are always in the way, walking like you own the place." The young woman froze. Her expression shifted from startled to something unreadable, her jaw tightening. For a moment, she seemed like she wanted to respond. Her lips parted, but then she stopped herself. Instead, she squared her shoulders and met Melanie's gaze with a calm, piercing look that sent an uncomfortable shiver down Melanie's spine. Without a word, the woman turned and walked away. Melanie exhaled sharply, adjusting her purse as she quickened her pace. Her heart pounded uncomfortably in her chest. A strange, twisting feeling curled in her stomach, a whisper of something she refused to name. The next morning, Melanie arrived at the store precisely at 8 o'clock. She adjusted her blouse, smoothed her skirt, and stepped inside. Jonathan stood near the counter, stacking a display of seasonal items. He looked up as she entered. "Morning, Melanie," he greeted warmly. "Ready for your first day?" "Yes, sir," she replied. The words felt bitter on her tongue. Jonathan nodded approvingly. "Let me call Vanessa. She's in the back, getting everything set up for your training." He turned toward the storage room and called out, "Vanessa, honey, Melanie's here." The sound of measured footsteps echoed from the hallway. A moment later, a familiar figure emerged from the back office. Melanie felt the blood drain from her face. Vanessa was the same woman she had run into yesterday. Her crisp white blouse and neatly pressed slacks gave her an air of effortless professionalism, but her expression remained unreadable. For a long, unbearable second, the two women stared at each other. Jonathan, sensing something off, glanced between them. "Everything okay?" Vanessa's face remained calm, but her dark eyes flickered with something that only Melanie could recognize, an unspoken understanding. "Of course," Vanessa said smoothly. "I have the training materials ready. We can start whenever you're ready." Jonathan nodded. "Great. You're in good hands, Melanie. Vanessa knows this store inside and out." Melanie swallowed hard. "Right," she said. Her voice came out tighter than she'd intended. Vanessa turned and gestured toward the back office. "Follow me, please." Melanie hesitated. Her stomach twisted. She followed Vanessa, but each step felt heavier than the last, like walking toward something inevitable. Vanessa led her into a small office, where a thick binder sat open on the desk. She flipped to the first page, her tone professional as she began explaining the morning procedures. Melanie barely heard her. Her mind was still reeling, and yet when Vanessa finally paused and looked at her, there was no anger in her expression, just quiet resolve. "About yesterday," Melanie blurted before she could stop herself. Vanessa held up a hand. "Don't," she said simply. She turned the page in the binder. "Now, let's go over the register procedures." Melanie nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. She listened. But for the first time in a long time, she also felt the unfamiliar weight of something else. Shame. The day passed in a blur of instructions, procedures, and the steady hum of business. Vanessa guided Melanie through each task with a level of patience that Melanie found both impressive and infuriating. She explained the store's inventory system, the cash register protocols, the policies for handling difficult customers. She never hesitated, never faltered, and never once brought up their encounter from the day before. Melanie, on the other hand, struggled to focus. Each time Vanessa spoke, each time she demonstrated a new process, Melanie felt the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. By closing time, she was exhausted, though she refused to let it show. As she gathered her things, Jonathan and Vanessa emerged from the back office carrying containers of food, the rich, warm scent of something homemade filling the air. "Melanie," Jonathan called out, holding up one of the containers. "We always have extra dinner. Would you like to take some home? Vanessa made her mom's famous stew today." Melanie's stomach twisted. She glanced at the food, at their easy smiles, and something inside her recoiled. "No, thank you," she said quickly, gripping the strap of her purse. "I need to get home." Jonathan's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't press. "All right, safe trip home." Melanie nodded stiffly before stepping out into the night air. She walked home faster than usual, her heart pounding harder than it should. The idea of accepting food from them made her skin crawl. Food they had touched, food they had prepared in their kitchen. She shook her head sharply, trying to push the thought away. Days turned into weeks, and Melanie fell into a rhythm at the store. She arrived at exactly 8 a.m. and left precisely at 5, keeping interactions to a minimum. She focused on the work, on the numbers, on the tasks that needed to be done. She avoided unnecessary conversations, ignored the growing sense of unease in her gut. She told herself she was doing fine. Then, one afternoon, something changed. The bell above the door chimed and a woman rushed in, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor. She was in her late 30s, blonde, well-dressed, her makeup flawless despite the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead. She clutched a large leather handbag close to her chest as she approached the front counter where Melanie was reviewing inventory sheets. "Excuse me," the woman said breathlessly. "Would you mind keeping my bag behind the counter while I shop? It's too heavy to carry around." Melanie looked up, noting the expensive gold bracelet on the woman's wrist, the designer logo on her handbag. "Of course," she said, reaching out to take the bag. "I'll keep it safe for you." "Thank you so much," the woman said, already turning toward the aisles. "I'll be quick." As the woman disappeared into the store, Melanie placed the bag behind the counter. It was heavier than she expected. Curiosity flickered in the back of her mind. Glancing around, she carefully unzipped the top. Her breath hitched. Inside, beneath a few ordinary items, a makeup case, a phone charger, a pack of tissues, were several neat stacks of $100 bills bound together with rubber bands. Melanie's fingers trembled as she quickly zipped the bag closed. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She forced herself to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to that bag. That money. She thought of the bills piling up at home, of her mother's prescriptions, of the calls from the hospital about overdue payments. That much money could change everything. Her hands clenched into fists as she tried to push the thought away. She wouldn't. She couldn't. And yet, a movement out of the corner of her eye made her jolt. Vanessa was approaching the counter, her steps light and even. Melanie's palms grew sweaty. "Could you watch the front for a minute?" she blurted out. "I need to use the restroom." Vanessa blinked at the sudden request, but nodded. "Sure." Melanie turned quickly and walked away, her heart hammering in her chest. She made it to the restroom, gripping the edges of the sink, trying to steady her breathing. When she finally stepped out, she forced herself to walk back to the counter as calmly as possible, but the moment she arrived, she knew something was wrong. The blonde woman, Sarah, Melanie vaguely remembered her introducing herself, was back, and she looked furious. "Where's my bag?" she demanded, her voice sharp with panic. Vanessa, unfazed, calmly retrieved the handbag from behind the counter and handed it to her. Sarah snatched it quickly, rifling through its contents. And then, her expression shifted, from anger to horror. Her head snapped up. "Where is it?" she hissed. "Where is what, ma'am?" Vanessa asked evenly. Sarah's hands shook. "The money." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, without hesitation, Sarah pulled out her phone. Melanie's stomach dropped. "Yes, I need police at the convenience store on Maple Avenue," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I've been robbed. The woman behind the counter, she stole thousands of dollars from my purse." The air in the store turned electric. Vanessa didn't flinch. Jonathan emerged from the back, concern etched into his features as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "She stole from me," Sarah cried, pointing a shaking finger at Vanessa. "I had $20,000 in my bag and now it's gone." Jonathan's eyes darkened. He turned to Vanessa. Vanessa met his gaze evenly. "I didn't take anything," she said simply. The bell above the door jingled again. 2 police officers stepped inside, their hands resting near their belts. "Ma'am," the taller officer said to Sarah, "please explain exactly what happened." Sarah launched into her story, her words fast and frantic. Melanie felt her stomach twist into knots. Her throat went dry. What had she done? Officer Martinez, the senior officer, turned to Vanessa. "Ma'am, do you have any explanation for this?" Vanessa's voice remained steady. "I never touched the money. You can check the security footage." Jonathan nodded. "Yes, let's do that right now." The group moved to the back office, where Jonathan quickly pulled up the security footage. The room was silent as the footage played, Sarah handing her bag to Melanie, Melanie placing it behind the counter, then Melanie leaving abruptly, Vanessa stepping in, Sarah returning. The officers exchanged looks. "Ma'am," the second officer said, turning to Sarah, "you originally handed your bag to this employee." He pointed at Melanie's figure on the screen. "Not Miss Vanessa." Sarah's face drained of color. I didn't realize," she stammered. Officer Martinez turned to Jonathan. "Do you have an address for this employee?" Jonathan hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then slowly he nodded. "Yes," he said. And as he wrote down Melanie's address, she was already halfway home, her stolen money weighing heavier with each step. Melanie's hands trembled as she unlocked the front door of her small apartment. The metal key scraped against the lock as she fumbled to turn it, her fingers slick with sweat. When she finally shoved the door open, she stepped inside and quickly shut it behind her, leaning against the cool wooden surface as she tried to steady her breathing. Her mother's frail voice called from the living room. "Mel? That you?" Melanie took a second to compose herself, forcing her voice into something normal. "Yeah, Mom, it's me." She heard the rustling of blankets as her mother shifted on the worn-out couch. The TV buzzed faintly in the background, stuck on one of those daytime talk shows her mother always watched to pass the time. "How was work?" Melanie swallowed. "Fine." She moved quickly through the small apartment, past the pile of medical bills on the kitchen table, past the nearly empty refrigerator humming softly in the corner. Everything in their home was a reminder of just how bad things had gotten. She reached her bedroom, closing the door behind her before she even dared to breathe. Slowly, she set her purse down and unzipped it. The thick wad of stolen bills stared back at her, crisp and fresh, bound together with rubber bands. $20,000, more money than she had ever held in her life. Her fingers brushed over the edges of the cash, and an electric jolt ran through her veins. This could change everything. She could pay off the overdue hospital bills, get her mother the medication she needed, buy fresh groceries instead of stretching canned soup across 3 meals. And yet, Melanie squeezed her eyes shut, gripping the money in both hands. It didn't feel like hers. It burned in her palms. A sharp knock at the front door jolted her out of her thoughts. Her stomach turned to stone. The knock came again, louder this time. She barely had time to stuff the money under her mattress before she heard her mother's voice again. "Melanie, someone's at the door." Melanie's heart pounded. She knew. She knew exactly who it was. She wiped her clammy hands on her pants and forced herself to step back into the living room. Her mother was still curled up under a knitted blanket, watching her with tired eyes as Melanie hesitated in the hallway. "Who is it?" her mother asked. Melanie ignored the question and approached the door. Through the peephole, she saw 2 uniformed police officers standing on the other side. The red and blue glow of their patrol car flickered across the narrow hallway. Melanie felt something deep inside her splinter apart. There was no getting out of this. She took a breath and opened the door. "Melanie Carter?" one of the officers asked, his expression firm but not unkind. Melanie forced herself to meet his gaze. "Yes. We need to talk to you about an incident that occurred earlier today at Reynolds's Market," the officer continued. Melanie gripped the edge of the door, her knuckles white. Her mother shifted on the couch, alarm flashing in her exhausted eyes. "Mel? What's going on?" Melanie opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Ma'am," the officer said carefully, "we need you to come with us." The words felt like an iron shackle snapping shut around her wrists. Her mother struggled to sit up fully, her breath catching in her throat. "Melanie?" Melanie turned to her, forcing a weak smile. "It's fine, Mom," she whispered, though nothing about this was fine. "I'll be back soon." She wasn't sure if that was a lie. The officers stepped aside, giving her space to exit. As Melanie walked past them and down the dimly lit hallway, she felt the weight of her mother's worried gaze following her. She wished she could turn back, but it was too late. The police station was colder than she expected. Melanie sat in a hard plastic chair, her hands clenched together in her lap, her pulse an unsteady drumbeat in her ears. Across the table sat Jonathan Reynolds and Vanessa, their expressions unreadable. The officers had stepped outside to discuss the next course of action, leaving the three of them alone in the small, fluorescent-lit room. The silence was suffocating. Finally, Jonathan spoke. "I trusted you." His voice wasn't angry. That made it worse. Melanie swallowed the lump in her throat. Vanessa sat beside him, her arms crossed, her eyes sharp. "You let me take the fall for you," she said, her voice even but firm. "Do you know how fast they were ready to believe I had stolen that money?" Melanie flinched. She did know. The accusation had been instant, automatic. She had watched it unfold, frozen in place as Vanessa had been blamed without a second thought. Melanie licked her lips, her throat painfully dry. But she had nothing to say. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "Tell me why, Melanie," he said, his voice edged with exhaustion. "Tell me why I shouldn't press charges." She clenched her jaw. "Because my mother is sick." The words burst out of her before she could stop them. Jonathan's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. Melanie's hands trembled as she finally met his gaze. "I wasn't thinking, all right? I saw that money, and all I could think about was how many hospital bills it would cover, how I could finally breathe for the first time in years." Vanessa's expression didn't change. Jonathan's gaze remained steady. Melanie took a shaky breath. "I messed up." The room went silent. Then Jonathan leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You know what's ironic?" he murmured. Melanie looked at him, her stomach twisting. He exhaled slowly. "If you had come to me and told me about your situation, I would have helped you." Melanie's breath hitched. Vanessa nodded, her voice softer now. "We would have found a way." The weight of their words crushed her. Her eyes burned as guilt clawed up her throat, sharp and relentless. Jonathan studied her for a long moment before finally leaning back. "I won't press charges," he said. Melanie's head snapped up. "What?" Jonathan sighed. "You're going to return the money. Every single dollar." Of course," Melanie stammered, the relief so sudden it nearly made her dizzy. "You're also going to quit," Jonathan added. Her stomach dropped. She opened her mouth to argue but closed it just as quickly. She had no right to argue. "I understand," she murmured. Jonathan nodded. Vanessa stood, smoothing out the front of her blouse. "I hope your mother gets better," she said simply. Melanie's throat tightened. "Thank you." Jonathan knocked on the door, signaling for the officers. As they re-entered, Jonathan gestured toward Melanie. "She'll return the money. We won't be pressing charges." The officers exchanged looks before nodding. "All right, sir. We'll make a report and close this out." Melanie let out a slow breath. She wasn't sure what came next, but as she walked out of that police station, out into the open night air, she knew one thing for certain. She had been given a second chance, and she wouldn't waste it. Jonathan crossed the small interrogation room in 3 swift steps, his body radiating barely contained fury. Before anyone could react, his hands clenched the collar of Melanie's wrinkled shirt, yanking her up from the cold, uncomfortable chair. "How dare you?" he growled, his voice thick with betrayal. "You tried to frame my daughter, after we gave you a chance, after everything we did for you." "Jonathan, stop." Vanessa's voice sliced through the tension, sharp yet controlled. She reached out, placing a steadying hand on her father's arm, her grip firm but filled with unspoken understanding. "Let her go. This isn't the way." Jonathan's fingers trembled with anger, but at Vanessa's words, he slowly loosened his grip. Melanie collapsed back into the chair, looking smaller than ever. Her red-rimmed eyes, swollen from crying, barely lifted to meet Jonathan's furious gaze. Her shoulders slumped forward, weighed down by the enormity of what she had done. "Why?" Jonathan demanded, stepping back but keeping his glare locked onto her. His voice held more than just anger. It carried disappointment, the weight of betrayal pressing against every syllable. "We gave you a job when no one else would. We trusted you. We treated you with respect. Why would you do this to us?" Melanie's lips trembled, her voice barely above a whisper. "My mother. She's sick." The words cracked as they left her throat, raw with emotion. "The medical bills keep piling up, and I just couldn't see another way out." Her fingers twisted in her lap as she forced herself to continue. "The debt collectors won't stop calling. Every day they hound us, threatening to take everything we have left. I was drowning, Jonathan. I still am. And Her breath hitched. "I panicked." She wiped at her tear-streaked face with trembling hands, unable to look at him. "Please, Mr. Reynolds, I know I messed up, but please don't press charges. My mother needs me. She doesn't have anyone else." Jonathan's expression remained unreadable, his jaw tight. For the first time since storming into the room, hesitation flickered across his face. "We all have struggles, Melanie," he said finally, his tone firm yet laced with something heavier. "You're not the only one." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "But you chose to handle yours by betraying someone who trusted you. You took from my family, my daughter. Do you know what that means?" Melanie's face crumpled under the weight of his words. "You think you're the only one who's suffered?" Jonathan continued, his voice dropping lower. "I know the pain of losing someone. I know what it's like to feel helpless, to want to fix things that are beyond your control." His throat tightened, but he pushed forward. "But that doesn't justify stealing. It doesn't make it right to hurt someone else." The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Melanie's quiet, stifled sobs. Then, without another word, Jonathan turned to the officer standing by the door. The man had remained silent throughout the exchange, his hands resting on his belt, watching the situation unfold with detached professionalism. Jonathan's voice, when he spoke again, was steady, unshakable. "I'm pressing charges." The words landed like a hammer. Melanie let out a choked gasp, her entire body going rigid. "Jonathan, please," she whispered, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The officer pulled out a notepad and started writing, his pen scratching against the paper in a way that made the reality of the situation unbearable. Melanie buried her face in her hands, her entire body trembling as the officer read her rights. A year in jail, a year away from her mother, all because of one desperate decision that had seemed like her only way out at the time. The prison cell was smaller than Melanie had imagined. The gray concrete walls closed in on her every day, the dim fluorescent light above flickering just enough to make everything feel slightly surreal. The metal cot creaked under her weight, the thin mattress offering little comfort. And across the cramped space sat her cellmate, Dana, a black woman, maybe in her early 40s, who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time. Every morning, Melanie would wake to see Dana sitting on her cot, braiding her hair in the dim light. "Morning," Dana would say evenly, offering a nod in greeting. Melanie would only grunt in response, rolling over to face the wall, her shoulders stiff with tension. The days blurred together, marked only by mealtimes, head counts, and the occasional echo of distant shouting from other inmates. But no matter how much time passed, one thing remained the same. Melanie hated Dana, not because of anything she had done, not because of anything she had said, but because deep down, Melanie knew that if their positions had been reversed, if Vanessa had been the one accused instead, no one would have questioned it. They would have believed it without hesitation, just like Sarah had, just like the police had. The thought haunted Melanie, though she refused to acknowledge it. Instead, she let her resentment fester. She spent her days pacing the yard like a caged animal, imagining all the ways she would make Jonathan and Vanessa pay once she got out. She'd destroy their store, ruin their business, make them feel the same helplessness she felt now. She clung to that hatred like a lifeline, something to hold on to in the endless sea of monotony that was prison life. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. The guards had handed it to her during mail distribution, the paper slightly crumpled but otherwise intact. Melanie hadn't expected it. Her mother's shaky handwriting scrawled across the front. Her stomach twisted as she tore it open, her eyes scanning the words quickly. And then she froze. Something unexpected happened, Melanie. Jonathan reached out to me, can you believe it? He's been sending money to help with the medical bills. And Vanessa. She visits sometimes, too. She brings groceries, asks if I need anything. They're really looking out for me. Melanie's hands clenched the letter so tightly that the paper crumpled beneath her fingers. Her heart pounded, but she didn't know whether it was from anger or something else. They think they're so much better than me, she thought bitterly, her jaw tightening. Helping my mother like this, acting like they're saints, like it makes up for what they did. Her vision blurred, the ink on the page smearing slightly from the pressure of her grip. She wanted to tear the letter apart, but she didn't. Instead, she folded it carefully, placed it under her thin pillow, and lay back on her cot, staring up at the cracked ceiling. And for the first time since being locked up, she couldn't tell if her anger was truly justified, or if she had been wrong all along. Melanie lay on the hard mattress, staring at the ceiling. The letter from her mother remained clenched in her fingers, the edges now crumpled from the force of her grip. The words burned in her mind, looping over and over. Jonathan reached out to me. He's been sending money for the medical bills. Vanessa visits sometimes, too. Melanie's jaw tightened. They thought they were better than her. They thought they could throw her in here and then act like the heroes by helping her mother. She twisted onto her side, her back to Dana, who was quietly reading in the dim cell. You good? Dana's voice was low but steady. Melanie ignored her. She wasn't good. She was boiling. Every time she thought about Jonathan Reynolds, her fingers curled into fists. Every time she imagined Vanessa stepping into her mother's home, checking on her like some noble savior, a bitter taste filled her mouth. They had no right. Melanie wasn't some charity case. She had made a mistake. Fine. But it wasn't like they were saints. It wasn't like Jonathan had never done things he regretted. She could feel Dana watching her. You keep stewing like that? You're gonna burn yourself up? Dana muttered before turning a page in her book. Melanie exhaled sharply. What did she know? Melanie shut her eyes, pressing the letter against her chest. But even as anger simmered inside her, a different feeling crept in. A feeling she refused to name. Guilt. It gnawed at her, sinking into the cracks of her resentment like water seeping into stone ready to split it apart. She tried to sleep. But that night, for the first time since she'd been locked up, the hatred wasn't enough to comfort her. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Every letter from her mother carried more news about Jonathan and Vanessa. Jonathan made sure the electricity bill was paid this month. Vanessa brought me a new blanket. It's getting colder at night. They even took me to a doctor's appointment when I wasn't feeling well. Melanie stopped opening the letters right away. She let them sit on her cot for hours, sometimes days, before forcing herself to read them. Each one chipped away at her anger. Each one made it harder to keep up the wall she had built. She told herself it was manipulation. They were just doing it to make themselves feel better. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. One evening, after lights out, Dana spoke up. You ever gonna admit you were wrong? Melanie lay still, facing the wall. Shut up, Dana. A low chuckle. That's what I thought. Melanie squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't need to admit anything. She just needed to get out. 1 year passed. The day of Melanie's release was bright and crisp. The air outside the prison smelled different, cleaner, fuller. The sun was warm on her skin, unfamiliar after so many months beneath harsh fluorescent lights. She clutched the small plastic bag that held her few belongings and walked out into a world that felt foreign. No one was there to meet her. She hadn't expected anyone to be. Her mother was too sick to travel, and there was no one else. She started walking, the weight of freedom sitting awkwardly on her shoulders. She had a bus ticket, but the idea of being surrounded by people made her chest tighten. She walked instead. Each step felt heavy. The world had moved on without her. People bustled past, their lives continuing as if she had never existed. She passed a small corner store. A little old lady was struggling with a bag of groceries, the bottom beginning to tear. Melanie watched as an apple tumbled onto the sidewalk. The woman let out a soft gasp, reaching for it, but it rolled just out of reach. People walked past her without stopping. Melanie hesitated. Then, without thinking, she bent down and picked up the apple, holding it out. "Here." The woman looked up, her face lined with age but warm with gratitude. "Oh, thank you, dear. My hands just aren't as strong as they used to be." Melanie shifted on her feet. "Do you need help carrying that?" The words felt strange coming out of her mouth. The woman beamed. "That would be lovely. I live just around the corner." Melanie adjusted the bag in her arms and walked with the woman, listening as she chatted about the weather, about her garden, about how the world was changing too fast for her liking. It wasn't much, but as Melanie helped carry those groceries to the woman's doorstep, something inside her cracked just a little more. She made it home later that night. The apartment smelled the same creaky floors, the same sagging couch. But her mother looked worse. Her skin was pale, her frame thinner than Melanie remembered. Her hands shook as she reached out. "Mel, you're home." Melanie dropped to her knees beside the couch, grasping her mother's fragile hands. "I'm here, Mom." Her mother smiled, though it was weaker than before. "I saved your room just how you left it." Melanie swallowed the lump in her throat. She hadn't cried in months, not when she was arrested, not when she was sentenced, not even when she had sat in that cold prison cell staring at the walls. But now, with her mother's frail hands in hers, the tears finally came. "I'm so sorry," she choked out. "For everything." Her mother cupped Melanie's cheek, her touch light as a feather. "I forgave you before you even left, baby." Melanie broke. She buried her face against her mother's shoulder, shaking with sobs. For the first time in a long time, she let herself feel everything. The guilt, the regret, the overwhelming love, and something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next morning, Melanie stood outside Reynolds Market. The storefront looked the same, but she didn't. Her hands trembled as she pushed open the door, the familiar chime ringing above her. Inside, Jonathan was restocking a shelf, his back to her. At the sound of the bell, he turned. The moment his eyes met hers, surprise flickered across his face. He set down the box he was holding, wiping his hands on a rag before stepping forward. "Melanie." Her throat tightened. "Mr. Reynolds?" she said softly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Melanie swallowed hard and forced out the words she had been holding in for months. "I came to thank you." Jonathan didn't say anything, waiting. Melanie's fingers twisted in her jacket sleeves. "My mom told me what you did, how you helped her, how Vanessa helped her." Her voice wavered. "You didn't have to do that. After what I did, you had every reason to let her suffer." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "I didn't do it for you, Melanie," he said. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." Melanie's chest ached. "I know words aren't enough," she whispered. "But I am sorry. For everything." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. "That's a good start." Tears burned at the corners of Melanie's eyes. She nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, It was the beginning of something better. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unspoken. Melanie stood at the entrance of Reynolds Market, her pulse thundering in her ears as Jonathan studied her. The weight of her words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. She had expected him to be angry. She had expected him to turn her away, maybe even tell her to leave and never come back. But he didn't. Instead, Jonathan exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw before nodding toward the counter. "Come sit." Melanie hesitated, then followed him to the small seating area near the store's back office. The wooden chair felt foreign beneath her, as if she didn't belong there anymore. Vanessa appeared from the storage room, stopping short when she saw Melanie sitting across from her father. Her eyes flickered with something unreadable, but she said nothing. Instead, she placed a small clipboard on the counter and crossed her arms. "You came back?" she said, her voice neutral. Melanie swallowed. "Yeah." Jonathan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table between them. "You say you're sorry," he said, his tone steady. "That's a start. But what exactly are you looking for, Melanie?" Melanie's fingers twisted in her lap. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head 100 times, but now, sitting in front of them, all the words felt wrong. "I don't know," she admitted. I needed to come here, to say it to your face." She let out a shaky breath. "And maybe to ask if there's any way I can make things right." Jonathan exchanged a glance with Vanessa, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Make things right?" Vanessa finally spoke, her tone carrying an edge of disbelief. "How, exactly?" Melanie flinched. She had expected this. She deserved this. "I don't know," she repeated. "I just know that I've spent a year thinking about everything I did, and I know I can't undo it, but—" She trailed off, rubbing her hands over her jeans. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Vanessa's expression remained guarded. Jonathan was silent for a long time before he finally leaned back. "You have a job now?" Melanie shook her head. "Not yet." "Where are you staying?" "With my mom." Jonathan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Do you know what you put us through?" he asked, his voice softer than before but still firm. "What you put my daughter through?" Melanie's throat tightened. "Yes." "Do you?" Vanessa cut in. Her voice wasn't angry, but it was sharp. "Because I don't think you do. You got locked up for a year. That was your consequence. But I was the one who almost got arrested for something I didn't do. I was the one who had police officers looking at me like I was guilty before I even had a chance to speak." Melanie felt the words like a slap. "I know," she whispered. Vanessa shook her head. "Do you?" "I do," Melanie insisted, her voice cracking. "And I'm so sorry." Another silence. Then Jonathan sighed, standing up. "Go home, Melanie," he said. "Get your life in order. Take care of your mother." Melanie's heart plummeted. That was it? That was the end of the conversation? "You're not going to give me a chance?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan's gaze softened just a fraction. "Not yet," he admitted. "But maybe one day. Maybe one day." The words echoed in her mind as she nodded slowly, rising from the chair. Vanessa still hadn't forgiven her. Jonathan wasn't ready to trust her again, but maybe, just maybe, there was hope. Melanie turned toward the door, feeling the weight of their gazes on her back as she stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. She had a long way to go. But for the first time in a long time, she was willing to walk the road ahead. The next few weeks were slow, filled with long nights taking care of her mother, and longer days searching for a job. No one wanted to hire a felon. She filled out application after application, but each time, the moment they asked about her record, the conversation shifted. The manager's polite smile tightened. The interest in her qualifications faded. "Sorry, but we're looking for someone with a clean background." She heard it over and over again. After the 10th rejection, Melanie sat on the curb outside a fast food joint, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. She couldn't do this. She was trying to be better. She was trying to do things the right way, but every door was slamming shut in her face. She pulled out her phone and hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she typed out a message. Melanie, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but if you hear about any jobs, any at all, please let me know. I'll do anything. She stared at the message to Vanessa for a long moment before pressing send. Hours passed. No response. She wasn't surprised. She went home, exhausted and defeated, ready to collapse onto the couch. But when she walked through the door, her mother was sitting up, a faint smile on her lips. You got a call, she said softly. Melanie's stomach flipped. From who? Her mother handed her a slip of paper. Vanessa Reynolds. Melanie's hands shook as she read the number scrawled in her mother's familiar handwriting. She swallowed hard, gripping the paper. She hadn't expected a response, let alone a phone call. She dialed the number before she could lose her nerve. The phone rang once, twice. Then, Melanie? Vanessa's voice was cautious, unsure. Yeah, it's me. A pause. Then Vanessa exhaled. Look, I don't trust you. Not yet. But my dad... Another hesitation. He might be willing to give you a chance. Melanie's breath caught. What do you mean? He needs extra help at the store. It's not a permanent position and you'll be on probation. But if you show up, work hard, and prove that you've changed... Melanie's chest ached. Are you serious? Vanessa sighed. Yeah. Melanie closed her eyes. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was her chance. Thank you, she whispered. You won't regret this. We'll see, Vanessa said, her voice unreadable. And then she hung up. Melanie stared at the phone in her hands, her heart pounding. She had a job. She had a second chance. She wasn't going to waste it. Melanie stood outside Reynolds Market, gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The familiar storefront looked almost the same as the last time she had seen it, but something felt different. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was the weight of everything that had led her back here. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed, the sound sending a jolt through her chest. Vanessa stood behind the counter, her posture stiff, her eyes wary. You actually showed up, she said, crossing her arms. Melanie swallowed. I said I would. Vanessa gave a slow nod but didn't say anything else. Instead, she turned toward the back of the store. Dad, she's here. Melanie heard heavy footsteps approaching. Then Jonathan emerged from the stockroom, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was unreadable as his gaze met hers. For a long, excruciating moment, no one spoke. Then Jonathan folded his arms. Follow me. Melanie hesitated before trailing behind him. He led her to the back office, where he gestured for her to sit. She did. Jonathan exhaled, leaning against the desk. Let's get one thing straight, he said, his voice even. This isn't about forgiveness. This isn't about me trusting you. You're here because I believe in second chances, but that doesn't mean you won't have to earn it. Melanie nodded, her throat dry. I understand. You'll be working under Vanessa, he continued. She'll decide if you keep the job. You mess up once, you're gone. No questions, no negotiations. Melanie felt Vanessa's presence behind her, silent but firm. I won't mess up, Melanie said, her voice steadier than she expected. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. He stood and motioned toward the door. Go on then. Vanessa will get you started. Melanie stood quickly and followed Vanessa out onto the store floor. She could feel Vanessa's scrutiny as they walked, her silence heavier than words. You start by stocking shelves, Vanessa finally said, handing her a clipboard. There's a delivery coming in an hour. You'll unload it, check the inventory, and restock anything that's running low. Melanie nodded. Okay. Vanessa hesitated. Then she sighed. Look, she said, rubbing her temples. I don't like this. I don't trust you. But my dad, he sees something in you. She leveled Melanie with a firm gaze. Don't make me regret this. Melanie straightened. I won't. Vanessa studied her for a second longer, then nodded. Good. Let's get to work. The first week was brutal. Melanie kept her head down, working harder than she ever had in her life. She stocked shelves, took inventory, learned the register. She stayed late, arrived early. She didn't complain when her feet ached, when customers were rude, when Vanessa gave her the cold shoulder. She didn't expect kindness. She didn't deserve it yet. But slowly, something started to shift. Vanessa's comments became less sharp. Jonathan gave her small nods of approval. The other employees stopped looking at her like she might steal something. It wasn't much, but it was something. One evening, after closing, Melanie was wiping down the counters when Vanessa approached her. You didn't run today, Vanessa said, leaning against the counter. Melanie blinked. What? The truck was late. We were understaffed. Customers were a nightmare. Vanessa shrugged. I figured today would be the day you quit. Melanie tightened her grip on the rag. I'm not quitting. Vanessa studied her for a long moment. Then, to Melanie's surprise, she smirked. All right, she said. Guess we'll see. Then she turned and walked away. Melanie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Maybe, just maybe, she was earning this. Weeks passed. Melanie fell into a routine. She worked. She went home. She took care of her mother. Every day was the same, and for the first time in her life, she was okay with that. Then one afternoon, the bell above the door jingled and a familiar face walked in. Sarah. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. Sarah. The woman who had accused Vanessa of stealing. The woman who had started the entire mess. Sarah froze when she saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't know you worked here. Melanie's fingers curled against the counter. I do. Sarah hesitated. Then slowly, she exhaled. Good, she said. Melanie blinked. What? Sarah shifted on her feet. I shouldn't have accused Vanessa that day, she admitted, her voice quiet. I jumped to conclusions. I was wrong. Melanie's stomach twisted. Sarah was the reason she had gone to jail. And yet, here she was, doing something Melanie herself had struggled to do for so long, taking responsibility. Melanie swallowed the lump in her throat. I was wrong too, she said, surprising herself. Sarah's eyes flickered with something, understanding maybe. Then she nodded. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Melanie exhaled slowly. The past would always be there. But maybe, just maybe, she could move forward. Months passed. Melanie had proven herself. The probation period ended, and Jonathan offered her a permanent position. She accepted without hesitation. Vanessa still wasn't warm, but the hostility had faded. They weren't friends, but they were something else. Co-workers. Equals. One evening, as Melanie locked up the store, Jonathan approached her. You've done good, he said simply. Melanie's throat tightened. Thanks. Jonathan studied her for a moment. You looking for more hours? Melanie blinked. What? We could use more help, Jonathan said. If you want it? Melanie's breath hitched. This was it. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But trust. Real trust. She swallowed hard and nodded. I'd like that. Jonathan smiled. Good. Then he turned and walked away. Melanie stood there for a long time, staring at the store she had once tried to steal from. She had a second chance, and for the first time she knew she wasn't going to waste it. Melanie left the store that night feeling something unfamiliar. A lightness in her chest, a sense of belonging she hadn't known she craved. She had spent so long expecting failure, expecting rejection, but she was still here. She had a job, a real one. And for the first time in years, she had a future that wasn't just about surviving from one day to the next. As she walked home through the quiet streets, she pulled out her phone and typed a message. Melanie, I got more hours at work. Her mother's response came almost immediately. Mom, that's wonderful, sweetheart. You deserve it. Melanie smiled softly. She wasn't sure if she deserved it, but she was going to earn it. The next few months passed in a blur of work and routine. Every morning she arrived at Reynolds Market before sunrise, helping Vanessa set up before the customers arrived. Every night she locked up, double-checking the register, making sure the shelves were stocked. It became second nature. This life she had built for herself, this stability she never thought she could have. She stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. She stopped assuming everything would fall apart. She had changed, and she wasn't the only one. Vanessa, while still guarded, no longer treated her like an outsider. Their conversations became easier, their silences more comfortable. They weren't friends, not exactly, but they were something. One evening, as they closed up for the night, Vanessa turned to her with an unreadable expression. You know, she said, crossing her arms, when you first came back, I was sure you wouldn't last a week. Melanie huffed a quiet laugh. Me too. Vanessa smirked. But you did. Melanie glanced around the store, taking in the shelves she had stocked, the register she had learned to operate, the space she had once seen as a place of betrayal but now saw as something else entirely. A second chance. Yeah, she said softly. I did. Vanessa studied her for a moment before nodding. See you tomorrow. Melanie smiled. Yeah, see you tomorrow. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Melanie had just finished sorting inventory in the stockroom when Jonathan called her into the office. She wiped her hands on her apron before stepping inside. Jonathan was sitting behind his desk, a piece of paper in front of him. Take a seat, he said. Melanie did. Jonathan slid the paper toward her. Her heart stuttered when she saw what it was, a management training application. She looked up at him, wide-eyed. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I don't do this lightly, he said, and I don't take risks on people who don't deserve them. Melanie's breath caught. But I see how hard you work, he continued, and I see that you care about the store, about the people here, and that's worth something. Melanie swallowed past the lump in her throat. You're not the same person you were a year ago, Jonathan said simply. She wasn't. And the fact that he saw that, really saw it, meant more than she could put into words. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the application. I won't let you down, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jonathan nodded. I know. She clutched the paper to her chest as she walked out of the office, the weight of it grounding her. A year ago, she had walked into this store full of resentment, full of anger. Now she walked out with something entirely different. Hope. A future. A second chance that she wasn't going to waste. That evening, Melanie walked home with a rare sense of peace. The city lights flickered against the dark sky, a soft breeze rustling through the trees. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring. Mel? Hey, Mom. Melanie smiled. I have news. Her mother's voice softened. Good news? The best, Melanie said. And for the first time in a long, long time, she truly meant it.